Under Wraps. Under Wraps. Under Wraps.
Morning. Welcome back to episode 4 of the variety show of Liam. We have, well, probably someone who I never thought I'd be able to get on the podcast. Peter John Vettese of Jethro, Tull. How about you say hello to everyone listening?
Okay, my name is Peter John Vettese, and it's a pleasure to be here with Liam. Hands across the water, and indeed
Yes.
evermore should remain so.
Indeed. So we'll be covering a lot of things, basically from the starting from your music, working with Tull, and even stuff after Tull as well. So I guess I'll be
Great.
starting off with beginning and growing up in music. So how did you start with music?
I always describe it like this. I was a musician before I decided to be a musician. So I was about 4 when I wandered up to a piano. And I liken this to, for some of your listeners that may be acquainted with Noam Chomsky, the linguist and philosopher. They may be acquainted with his theory in the acquisition of language, which is either, in his view, is nativist, but is also there's an empiricist idea of the acquisition of language. I find the acquisition of music to be the same, which is to this extent that when I first wandered up to a piano, we had a piano at home. My father was a musician, a saxophone player from the big band era, and we had a piano at home, and I went up to the piano. And if you see very, toddlers and young people, when they first experience a piano, they start, just playing random notes, but something draws them in. I did roughly the same, except I started playing chords quite early on. They would all be, I suppose, now looking back, I think they were mainly triads, all the white notes. So C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B flat 5, B minor flat 5. So I would play all those, and it was fascinating to me that that this somehow made a connection to living. Yes, it was a connection to life that was crucial to me. A few days ago, somebody said to me, and it's an understandable question, is that when I play something and they asked me, "Do you hear this in your head?" First of all, and I have to say that no, I don't. I don't hear it in my head. First of all, and then go and play it. It's synchronous. And I'm not even sure if there's a representation of whatever it is that's out there that gets produced by my actions as an instrumentalist. I'm not even sure if that's fully represented in a high fidelity kind of way as a mental, as a thought, as opposed to a thought followed by action. So in answer, yeah, that was a very long answer, sorry. I started at around about 4. I didn't decide to become a musician. It somehow was decided for me.
Right, that's very interesting to hear. So obviously your dad was the more musically inclined one of the family rather than your mother. Were you ever musically trained, or were you sort of given lessons?
Well, my mother was also musical and very literate, my mother. I come from a generation, Liam, that sometimes has been unaware of the genetic contribution that the maternal side of the family can make to the progeny. And my father's music was a very obvious gift, if you consider it a gift. That always invokes a gift giver, but we shall not tread into that area. And but the gift of music that my father's genetic substance gave me also was a literate aspect. I think it was my mother's side of the family, and those came together in my being. I was sentient, very sentient musically, and aware, as I said, from around about 4, 5, and then, as you might imagine, I became quite opinionated about what would constitute the human good in terms of what I would do with this. My mother and father wanted me to go to piano lessons, and so even by that time my ear had developed to such an extent that I was now, by the age of 6 or 7, I was, playing, the popular hits, the popular songs of the day, and some of my father's 30s, 40s, 50s repertoire. I discovered early on, now what's known as altered chords. So the great universe of polyphony was present. When I went to piano lessons, I had to go back to that kind of. They weren't as switched on, Liam, as a lot of the educational institutions that are today. And the first piano teacher I went to insisted in doing these, going through these exercises, like aligning a lyric such as "Go and tell Aunt Dinah" with the notes E, D, and C. Go and tell Aunt Dinah. Go and tell Aunt Dinah. In the meantime, when I went home, I was starting to play excerpts from Miles Davis albums and so on. So there was a bit of a collision one way or another, and it meant that my formal piano tuition didn't get into sync with my musical ability till much later on in life. I don't think. Some would say it never did come into sync.
Yeah. So, what was the first band that you reckon you played with?
It was my dad's band, and I would be about 8 or 9. The small ensemble, and I like to tell the story of my eldest brother, who was 20 years older than me, was a saxophone player like my dad, but he was a good reader, but not a good improviser. And so that when my eldest brother would be in my father's band playing in a sax section, and my father would say to him, as the sort of conductor at the front, would say in the middle of a song, my father would say, right, stand up and take a chorus. And that was the old-fashioned language for stand up and start improvising over the chord progression of whichever song it was. My brother didn't like this. He couldn't really do it naturally. And his thoughts were, my father hates me. 20 years later, and I come along, and I'm playing piano in my dad's band. My father shouts at me, right, take a chorus. And I couldn't wait to get, tucked into whatever it was, Caravan, get tucked into whatever it was. And my feelings were, my father loves me. The problem my dad had with me is once I'd started, I wouldn't stop. So it meant that there was, when we were doing some of these strict tempo dancing gigs, like at the Seaforth Hotel in Arbroath in Scotland, taking chorus after chorus or improvising Caravan for 15 minutes wasn't necessarily going down a storm with the fee-paying guests. I understood why, but when you're young, I couldn't give a toss. It was all about just playing and enjoying the moment. Very selfish.
Yes, as a fellow musician, I can definitely agree to that. I'm a drummer and also a keyboardist, much like you as well. So
I play a little bit of drums, and if you want to hear some of my latest drumming episodes, I did during or at the beginning of lockdown, the first lockdown. Um, I I did just well. I started out on a little series of what they call reharmonizations of some Joni Mitchell songs, and I put one up on YouTube. It's called it's a reharmonization of Woodstock, um, which I've got. It's Woodstock, and then in brackets I put the Garden. Anyway, I played kit on that as well as all the other keyboards and sang the melody and so on and so forth. For those that are interested, and there are a stunning 923 people so far that have found that irresistible. Yes, I'm playing everything, including drums on that one. So that's yes, I play drum like you, Liam. I play drums and keyboards. It's quite oftentimes I'm sure you'll find in your life, and a lot of my heroes are tasty drummers as well. A recently departed Chick Corea, who was a keyboard playing hero, a piano playing hero of mine, was also a lovely drummer. And then in the fusion era, there would be somebody like Jan Hammer. He came to fame or prominence by writing and performing the Miami Vice theme, which was an 80s what would you call it? Cop.
It's like it's like a detective show. I'm probably well aware of what you're talking about.
Yes, and Jan Hammer was one of the first of the breed to do that thing with a mini moog to make it sound like mini moog, I should say, to make it sound like a guitar. And play like a guitarist and play licks like a guitarist. But Jan Hammer was also a drummer and a very nice drummer. So more recently, there's another favourite keyboard player of mine, a British keyboard player, brilliant, called Gary Husband, who we mostly all knew as being a sensational drummer, and but he's also a fabulous, fabulous piano player. So there's something about it that for a certain genre specific, I think this would be type of player, that the percussive elements and the rhythmical elements and the, of compound time and contrapuntal left, right, and so on and so forth is that's an attraction for drummers and keyboard players.
I guess you could say the same thing about Mark King as well from Level 42, who was started as a drummer but ended up being a bass player.
Yes, and he's sensational. Coincidentally, Gary Husband went on to play drums in Level 42 as well.
Yeah.
So Mark King is absolutely. Well, you often find. I mean, you find this, for instance, in every type of music, and the things that you have to do and become aware of to be, for instance, a classical conductor, or to learn the spread of instruments. And oftentimes, it's a good idea to learn the instrument to an extent, or have a familiarity with the thing anyway. So I suppose it's not that unusual for us all to play more than one thing. But in regard to pop, rock, and fusion or jazz, there's quite an occurrence of drummers and keyboard players, or drummers and guitar players, and so on and so forth, bass players and so on.
Yeah. So you mentioned you are from Scotland. So what part of Scotland did you really originally grow up in?
I was born in Seafield, Midlothian, which is near Edinburgh. But as you can imagine, I was born in 1956, and by the 60s, you can imagine, Liam, that my father, being a big band saxophone player, the phone wasn't ringing off the hook by then for his services. So my father had to pretty much do whatever it took to try and earn a living to bring up his 5 children. And my father was Italian, which meant that it seems the genetic combination was was hazardous to everybody's health at some time. We were a fiery lot. My other two brothers were also musicians, albeit they stopped at, depending on your view, or at semi-pro level. They got proper careers and everything. Well, what was known in those days as proper careers. I don't like that terminology now, because I've had what could be considered by some to have been a proper career. So I shouldn't denigrate the career of a musician like that by saying that, being a school teacher or a brain surgeon is in any way, more legitimate or less legitimate. I don't feel that. So I shouldn't have said that. I'm right. I roll back. Right, that's taken back. So I was born in Seafield, Midlothian, which is outside Edinburgh. But because of the peripatetic nature of my father's business pursuits, it meant that we relocated to somewhere where he was born. We think he may have been born in Italy, but certainly my mother was born in a place called Brechin, which is near Aberdeen. So, and then I lived in that area, Dundee, Brechin, Forfar, the epicenter of jazz, and I came down to Edinburgh back down to Edinburgh in the late 70s. And that's when I saw the advert in the then rock newspaper, The Melody Maker, and the advert read, "International rock band requires keyboard player. Apply within." I did. And it transpired that it was Jethro Tull that I was applying for.
Yeah. So this leads on definitely now into working with Jethro Tull, helping with the creation of Broadsword and Under Wraps, guest starring on Rock Island and the Walk in Light solo album for Ian Anderson. So you have definitely described how you got the job, as described. So what was your first impression of Jethro Tull? At the time, had you heard of the band?
Yeah, I remember hearing them, and in the common room when I was in 5th or 6th year, and thinking it was way too sophisticated for my tastes at the time. But really, my way into Jethro Tull was that when I had to apply for any job, Liam, to try, we were so poor, and so that my father and I would have to work, as musicians in whatever we could get. I played in pubs and clubs and so on. So did my father. I would back cabaret and be in, several bands at the same time, jazz or rock bands, or pop bands. But mostly it was, covers type bands. So when I answered that ad in the Melody Maker, I quickly had to listen to whatever Jethro Tull had been doing for the previous, by then, 15, 20 years. And the thing that pulled me in was is listening to the A album, of course, because Eddie Jobson would have been, aspirational in terms of trying to acquire that level of skill. And so when I listened to A, I thought, I could do this. And when I went down to audition for them, I travelled down to London in my ex-post office van, which had been hand-painted red to cover up post office, the sign writing on the side, but you could still see it. And so I often tell the story. I left the door of our family home, by this time now in the outskirts of Edinburgh, at the end of my father's shoe, who said, "Get out and don't come back until you've got a job." He may have even just said, "Get out and don't come back," and not added the proviso of until you've got a job. So I, with £30 to my name and an ex-post office delivery van, I loaded my ARP Odyssey and my Fender Rhodes into the back of this van and drove down to London for these auditions with Jethro Tull. On the second day of the auditions, I started vibing, inventing bits of music, the Ian Light, and and certain instrumental passages that were ultimately used on Broadsword and the Beast. And at the end of that day, of the audition day, Ian sent the other band members out and asked me if I would like to do the gig. And I said, yes, I'd love to. And he said, right, well, you can join the band. We're going to start making an album, which was already sort of in the works. I think Ian's kind of forgotten about the contribution that I made, but it was so long ago anyway. It's his prerogative. It was, what's that, 40 years ago? I mean,
Yeah,
I've
nearly.
forgotten.
Yeah, nearly that, like 1982, 1981. So maybe even
Yeah.
this year's, maybe 40 years.
Yeah, and it must be coming up because there's a Jethro Tull predicated fan mag called A New Day, and they interviewed me recently because they hadn't interviewed me previously. Because, and strictly speaking, Liam, the founder members, the original Jethro Tull members were the classic traditional sound of Jethro Tull. That was their identity. And when I joined the band, and it being the 80s, I came in with a whole different notion of how I wanted, not necessarily Jethro Tull to be, but how I was going to interface with them. I was an early adopter of synthesizers and samplers and sequencers, and the traditional aspects of Jethro Tull weren't weren't necessarily of great interest to me. Having said that, by the time we got to Under Wraps, I had tired of the drum machine synthetic nature of the thing. Actually, I would have preferred Under Wraps to have had musicians, or at least a drummer instead of a drum machine, and also I think I would have preferred to have played whatever was purporting to be a traditional or acoustic instrument. I would have preferred to have actually played that thing rather than a sample or a synthetic rendition of. But by that time we were all in full flow and captivated by the burgeoning technology of the early 80s. It's understandable. It was simply reacting to our life and times.
So, Broadsword and the Beast, which was the first album you did, do you ever think the first ever in your band would be loved by the Tull fan base so much?
No, somebody. The answer has got to be no, and I hope this doesn't sound fatuous, because it can sound fatuous. Somebody asked me a few days ago on my Facebook, did you know you were doing something special when you did Broadsword and the Beast? And the answer is, of course not. But I felt special doing it, and there is a difference, and it's a major difference. There's nothing as horrible as and immodest as thinking that whatever you're doing is special at the time that you're doing it. Of course, it's aspirational to want to try to get something that you believe to be special, but it's a different thing, that remain aspirational. But you can feel special about doing it, and I did feel special in that I felt quite blessed and very grateful to have gone from this impoverished family background and suddenly and playing in pubs and clubs, nothing wrong with that, but I went from that straight to playing in an international rock band, which at the time were guaranteed, sales of in excess of 1 million albums on the day that they said they were about to embark upon making one. So it was a different time, Liam, and I felt very grateful and very honoured and, as I say, blessed to have been chosen to participate in the making of Broadsword and the Beast. So it made me feel special. But because the nature of reaching for an artistic high necessarily entails the idea of never being satisfied with whatever it is, it means that you can't feel that, in my view, so this is my view, you can never feel terribly satisfied with whatever it is because you're always reaching for something more. So you can never, in my view, describe what you're doing as special, but you can feel special doing it. And that's how I feel, and that's how I felt in hindsight, about the making of Broadsword and the Beast.
Yeah, because I actually had a friend named Joshua Bannon who'd never listened to any of the 80s stuff for Jethro Tull before, and I said to him, well, a great place to start would be Broadsword and the Beast because it sounds very sort of reminiscent of sort of 70s styles. And he thought that the album had great production, that it was the sort of best sounding one for the 1980s. They thought the mixing was well done, so if you want some feedback, there you have it.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem that ultimately, if you consider this a problem, and it's what all artists, certainly of the time and definitely now, have to face, is that they become a hostage to fortune. Is that if when they establish a musical direction, that when they establish a lineup, let's say, and they establish a fan base, that they are often, understandably obliged to keep it coming. But the artistic way is not necessarily adjudged through what the outcomes of all of these machinations are. It's the methodology and the process, I think, that's important. What was important about Broadsword and the Beast is I think it was quite a good transitional model from what was to perhaps a portent as to how Jethro Tull were going to have to react to the changing society and musical tastes, and it's well documented, all of this. I thought it was a good transitional model. And when you say 70s, I think that's, or your friend was saying it's 70s, good production. I think there were several crucial things about Broadsword and the Beast. One was it was produced by Paul Samuel Smith. So it was a producer, aside from Ian, that was presiding over some of the choices. And it's not that it was so proactive in that regard, but simply that Paul Samuel Smith was there and gave a certain legitimacy and permission for us to be something in the grand scheme of things, within the framework of what we might think of Jethro Tull-ism. It gave Ian freedom, though, to push forward. I think maybe for the last time, I don't know, that would be my own prejudicial view, because Jethro Tull after that, I think, became a little bit like Jethro Tull without being Jethro Tull. Broadsword and the Beast was Jethro Tull, I think, in that the process was good, and when you bring up the idea of the 70s, we recorded that album at Ian's studio in London, in Fulham in London, called Maison Rouge, and it's now, looking back on it, it's gone now, it's destroyed, and it was what I call a fluffy room. There was carpeted walls and deep carpet on the floor, and it was almost anechoic. There was no live. Though actually there was one or two stone rooms, for the live so-called sound, where there would be reflections. But the drums were recorded in the fluffy room where there would be no reflections, and that meant that the drum sound was quite dry, and I personally love that. And that much of the tracking was done live. So it was rehearsed as a band and tracked as a band playing together. So the red light would come on, everybody would stiffen up, and we try and get through it without making any errors. But it was rehearsed and played as a band, kind of like it used to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of like what it used to be back in the day when everyone had the talent and actually played a part in the role, not like nowadays. I mean, you got musicians who still do that, but currently 80% of the music is not like that anymore, to be honest.
No, just to to come back there, Liam. I think that the current breed of young musicians, those that play, are fantastic. I get a great deal of inspiration from some of the young players who can play in an ensemble and are fabulous. But you're right. One of the difficulties, and I was in the vanguard of this, I have to say, so I'm partly to blame, is that that back in the early 80s, the first sequencers were coming around, and it meant that you could play something. Not, I didn't do this, but it meant you could play, but not necessarily in real time. You could assemble a performance, in sort of unitary or modular parts. Then at the end of it, you could press play, and it sounded as if it had been a performance to a certain extent, without having had gone through the rigmarole of having to learn how to play the thing from top to bottom. I always played the thing from top to bottom because I always thought that the dynamics of playing, even in a 3-minute song, you're a different. This is depends on your concept of the persistence of identity, but I believe you're a slightly different person 2 minutes into playing a song than you were at the beginning of the song. Well, that's just a fact. You are slightly different in some way, which means that something happens during the course of a song when you're playing. There's a dynamic that shows up. There's change takes place, and that aspect of popular music making in the mainstream seems to have been ebbing away, and it often renders some popular, not all, but some popular music, to my ears, a bit dead, a bit lifeless. Yeah,
It's a bit dry.
It's the way of things, isn't it? But there are plenty of young, fabulous performers, hardly ever in the mainstream. But I have a view about how music has a timbre or a feeling, depending on its geographical location. And then it's predicated on this whole idea, which is some people find more plausible than others, but of the association with the pentatonic blues minor scale, which is the most ubiquitous scale, as being in some way related to the harmonic overtone series. So those blues scales, if you listen to, well, there's three distinct places in the world that you can listen to, and yet the music of it, the pure music of it, is roughly the same. It's pentatonic blues minor. Say, for instance, the blues from New Orleans, the blues from Tuva, where the throat singers are from, and then Scotland. There's this Scottish, this kind of yearning type of blues scale. But the narratives for each are very different. In the New Orleans blues, that would be about having been perhaps done wrong by the woman or the man, and so it's a way of chasing away the blues. Or, for instance, the blues originally in that regard was to do with the holler songs and the oppression, slavery, the yearning for my homeland. And in Tuva, they had a particular thing of raising or rearing or animal husbandry in the form of wild horses, and often, occasionally, well, often, but occasionally, um, a horse would go missing overnight, and that's what those narratives were about. All of these things are blues one way or another, and they emanate from different parts of the globe, and they have their own intrinsic feeling. And so I can imagine, it's a long answer, I do apologize, Liam, but I can imagine, even though my tangential acquaintance with the Scottish band you mentioned, but I can imagine they can bring, something to bear just on the basis of where they're from.
Because they create like very like melodic type of stuff, so it's kind of like very like into your soul type of music that sort of captivates you. But anyway, I want to talk about. Oh, sorry.
Depends on that's the listener. It's a two-way thing, that, Liam, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So
It's all opinion
carry
based.
on.
It's like consumer
Yeah,
versus creator type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to allow for the input of the listener as well.
I wanted to touch on, in the Under Wraps era, touring Australia in 1984, towards the end of 1984. What can you recall from that final tour with Jethro Tull from Brisbane, Sydney, Adelaide, and Melbourne?
Well, it was tough, is the main thing. At the end of the previous leg of the tour, which was coast to coast America, and Ian by this time had developed so much difficulty with his voice and trying to sing what I'm sure your listeners and will probably know, if they're interested in Jethro Tull at all, is that Ian Anderson has given everything to his trade. He's given everything, including his voice. It's rock and roll. I gave you the best years of my life. He's made a wonderful life for himself, but he has sacrificed quite a lot along the way. I mean, he doesn't need our sympathy. He's in that regard, he's made a wonderful life for himself, but he gave everything. I was there to watch Ian coming out every night on that coast to coast American tour and being in terrible pain, not knowing whether or not he'd get through the gig without losing his voice, and yet wanting to play, sing, and deliver. It's a great thing, and for that he has earned my eternal respect. And in that regard, he would be a role model. He gave everything, but against that, I would say that a lot of the time Ian didn't make things easy for himself. And what happened at the end of that coast to coast American tour was that we had, I think, 2 or 3 weeks off. Myself, Martin Barn, Dave Pegg, and Don Perry, who were the band at the time, we stopped off in Hawaii on the way to Australia and had a glorious couple of weeks in the sun. Ian went back home to Scotland and promptly got the flu because it was freezing and horrible. It was winter. And so by the time we showed up in Australia, we arrived with our, Hawaiian, what are they called, the fronds, the lies, or the flowers, right, and our shirts with the flowers on. And Ian showed up with just a massive cold, and his voice was in even worse shape. It would have been, in my view, better had he come with us into the sun and just, rested his voice. But he went back home, attended to his business. We all understand that. So my impression of Australia was it was dominated by Ian's continuing difficulty with his voice. And it meant that we had to amend quite a lot of the repertoire to include instrumentals. Now, there was something absurd about this, Liam, that I've got to tell you. Ian Anderson uses a technique called overblowing. I don't know. Do you know of that term?
Would that be something for the flute because he's a
Yeah.
flute player?
Yeah, and it's called overblowing, and it was popularized by Roland Kirk and a few others. It's that when you're playing, you're blowing over the hole, the embouchure. So when you blow over the hole of the flute, that produces a note, along the length of the tube, which are keys to change the note of the apparent length of the tube, and so the notes are higher or lower. And but you can also accompany it with singing. So if I blow and sing at the same time, that's what Ian was doing when he was playing the flute. So that when he said we have to do more instrumentals so that he didn't sing as much, I don't think he fully realized, and he's a super intelligent guy, that he was still continuing to sing for even though they were instrumentals. And typical of Ian, he was still giving it everything, every ounce of his strength. He's a phenomenal man, but he's still singing. And it's actually, when you think on it, it's blowing and singing at the same time. Can you imagine the column of air that's shooting up through your vocal cords to do both at the same time? It doesn't bear thinking about. So things were getting worse. And there was, even though I was young and I was looking at him, I could feel his pain. There was nothing we could do to, I was a whippersnapper. I wanted to say, Ian, you're making things worse. Well, let's just take things down a few semitones rather than, and we started doing that anyway to try and save him a little bit. We started playing things in different keys, but then some of those things are difficult from, let's say, not from a piano playing point of view, because piano players, it's much easier for a piano player, to go, yeah, okay, it's not in B flat, we're going to do it in A flat. There's no real difference in terms of being able, if you can play, if you've learned how to play, there's no difficulty in doing that. But for some guitars that might be capoed, to have things like Songs from the Wood or Aqualung, those are things that might be difficult to manifest a tone down or a few tones down. And also it requires rehearsal. So we had to endure Ian's difficulty, which manifests itself as a fairly miserable, it's a fairly miserable thing. There's nothing we could do about it. And it was actually at the end of the American leg of that tour, the Under Wraps tour, I think. Was that the Under Wraps tour? I can't remember now.
Yes, it was 1984.
Yeah. Right, and I decided that was it for me. I couldn't. This was no good because I like to think of myself as a realist and grasping the nettle. And sometimes you've just got you've got to accept, some kind of, if not surrender, then some kind of defeat in order to regroup in another way. I wish Ian had done that then, because he's gone on to hobble himself terribly with his vocal cords. And selfishly speaking, I would have preferred to listen to him in good shape, but he wasn't by the time he showed up in Australia. So it made it a little bit tough for us. However, as this was my first experience of Australia, I was more than happy to embrace, these different people, the likes of which I'd never encountered before, and I met, and I should have prepared this, Liam, because I've just remembered I met a fella who went to the extent of having a chip blown for my Yamaha DX7, so that every time you turned it on, my name would come up. And if he's ever listens to this, I can tell you now, that's gone nowhere. That thing, that it will always be a prized possession of mine. Not because it's a Yamaha DX7, but because he went to the effort of getting that chip blown with my name on it. Nothing to do with ego. It's to do with, that's a very lovely thing for somebody to do for you. So yes, I met some of what would become my Australian friends. I mean, I'm not particularly social, not antisocial. I'm just not social. But I don't have many Australian friends. But the Australians that I've encountered, you know, and you can't love or hate a nation predicated on their wherever it is. But my experience of the Australian psyche has always been good.
Well, I guess since you mentioned the DX7, and I do have a love for vintage instruments myself, particularly the 1980s instruments, do you still own any keyboards from the 80s with you?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, Liam. There's a loft full of very splendid things.
Oh my god.
Amongst them is a Yamaha CS80.
Yep.
Oh yeah, and I kept a lot of my Roland synthesizers from the epoch. They come out every now and then, but they're quite frangible. I also kept let me see. I kept my beloved, and it is very beloved, Rhodes Chroma, and the Rhodes Chroma expander, of which there were 18 made. So I've kept that. And I kept my emulator. It's probably worth about £3, $20 now. But I've kept my emulator too. I could never. It's in the loft as well. And I kept my the original Roland MC202 that I did a lot of the programming on. What was it? Walk Into Light, Ian's so-called solo album. I did a lot of programming on that MC202. It's a miserable thing to program, but I've kept that as well. It looks a little worse for wear now, but I've kept that. And then there were some modular synthesizers that I've kept. I didn't take them on the road, but there was a part of a Roland System 100 as well that I've kept. But it's there's been something of a resurgence in these analog or modular systems in the form of a Eurorack form, with exchangeable and changeable modules and stuff. So I also have a modular synth, a monosynth now, an RS that's made in the form of an Onged Martineau, which was I've got a comb filter as well as a low pass filter on it, and 3 oscillators, and an Onged Martineau, the ring controller with the so it's a fretless keyboard, as it were.
I always liked the Yamaha CP70, the electronic piano that Yamaha did for the 1980s. I thought maybe you would have kept that as well. That is a pretty iconic piece of the 1980s right there.
Yeah, and the CP70, I actually it sounds good now in retrospect, but let's say in a context, Genesis or I think they are one of the better examples of it. But when I had the CP70, I thought it was miserable, because the low strings in particular were pretty horrible. They were short and thick. They had a lot of wolf tones, and I wanted something that actually sounded like a grand piano. And in those days, the CP70 was, albeit, it had strings and piezo pickups and so on and so forth, and it was closer than we'd gotten for a long time. But I thought the next generation, although they weren't particularly good, but the next generation of electronic pianos, in that they were part sampled, sounded better in trying to be like a grand piano. Anyway, my CP, I had a CP80,
Oh,
the 88 note version of it that was, and I found that a little bit. I have to say, sorry, Liam, you won't like the sound of this, but I found the CP80 to be roughly the same as that apocryphal statement about boat ownership. The two happiest days, of boat ownership is the day you get it and the day you get rid of it. And that definitely applied to my CP80 because it was actually would have been better as an anchor by the time I got shot of it. And now current electronics and modelling in particular are far superior. But I do know, looking back on the CP80, it didn't sound much like a real piano, but it had a sound of itself that was iconic for the age. So I can accept that in that regard, I was probably, well, I think hindsight has probably seen me to, would say that I was probably wrong, but I'm talking about pure sound and the fact that, of course, I couldn't hump the thing about. Although I have to say, there was one gig I got phoned up by a friend of mine, an American friend of mine that lives in London. He phoned me up and he said, "Pete, this guy's let me down and I'm playing a gig at the, what was it called? It was this tiny little jazz club in a basement in Sloane Square in London. Pete, the guy's let me down. Can you come and play?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I was in Jethro Tull at the time. So what was the name of the club? I've forgotten it. It doesn't matter. It was in a basement. And at the time, being in Jethro Tull, I asked Kenny Wiley, who's the Jethro Tull's road manager, if he would care to take my stuff down to this jazz club, which included my CP80 and an Oberheim at the time, an Oberheim OBX, and several other things. Could he take my stuff down to the jazz club, which he did, and he set it up. When I showed up, it occupied the entire stage. And they were going, "Hey, Pete, can we put you off to one side because we got to play on the same stage?" And my setup was so huge and ungainly at that time. And I thought, well, how much longer am I going to be playing in Jethro Tull with access to an internationally road-ready crew? Well, wasn't going to be that much longer, was it? So that was another reason to get shot of the CP80. Later on, I did buy a CP70 to get that sound, to do the CP70 sound for a record I was doing at the time, long after Jethro Tull. But I wasn't so keen. I liked the action. The action was fine. But the racket the thing made wasn't necessarily to my taste at that time.
So I've asked some questions from the Jethro Tull Facebook Australia fan page, and we got 2 questions. No, actually, it was more like 5 questions in. So first question coming from Jen Copering, and he asks, "Hello, Peter John. Were you very surprised how much fun it was being a Tull during the Broadsword tour? I was very impressed with your solos on stage on October the 6th, 1982. So that's probably the American leg.
Yeah.
Also, do you still have your cat that was on your keyboards?"
Yeah, there was a reason for that thing, and I just can't remember what it was. I think it was the cat was to do with, and I could be mistaken, because its eyes lit up, and I think it was something to do with the beast.
Yes, the
that
beast
might
puppet.
be on Ian's back at the time. I can't. No, I don't know what happened to that cat. And I'm more of a dog person in real life than cat person, so I wasn't. I didn't follow the career of that cat post Jethro Tull, but I'm very happy to, of course, hear that I was in some way. In some way, I contributed to the happiness. And what was the fella's name? Jim Copperning, is it?
Yeah, so Jim Corpening, I think his name
Yeah.
was. I'm not sure if that's saying that right. If he's listening, do correct me.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yes,
Well, I've seen him on Facebook commenting about things. I think it's the same fella, and that's very kind of him to say about my soloing. Often in my soloing, and this is still happens today. What I would do would be, so my father taught me this actually, is that I would have a set piece at the beginning of my piano solo, but I would warn at the time Jerry and then Paul Burgess and then Don Perry. I'd warn them, but I'm not going to play the same thing every night. I'm going to leave. So I'm going to play the first minute or so. We'll know what that is. The next 5 minutes of whatever it was, I was going to improvise, depending on how I felt, where I was, and what we were up to, or what the influences were at the time. And then we would have, I would design an ending so that we could end together. But much of that keyboard solo that Jim's talking about is the central portion of that is entirely improvised,
so
probably for the first time.
Yep. We have 5 questions from Lucas Was, who asks, "Hello, Peter. First question is, what was your favorite tour with Tull?" The second question is, what do you think about an idea of remixing Under Wraps with Real Jones, which is something we kind of touched on briefly. Question 3 was Terry Alice really so upset after finishing whiskey during the Under Wraps sessions? And the final question is number 4, did you play table tennis with others backstage at Tull shows? All the best from Poland.
That's very nice. Well, try. I can't quite remember the order of these things. I in reverse maybe. Table tennis was very important, especially in the tours that didn't have a break between one gig and another. If Coast to Coast America was very, as I say, in the early days was very brutal. So the table tennis was extremely important, but it mainly took place just between wee band members. But I mean, I have a photograph of that I was going to send to the Jethro Tull, A New Day magazine. In fact, I have sent it to them, but he hasn't published it. Of Ian, myself, Martin, and Dave Pegg playing table tennis just prior to going on stage, and there was always there was something of a dare to this, because Ian and I often would still be playing table tennis when the introduction music was still going on. And we would often wait to see how late we could keep playing table tennis prior to showing up on stage. But what was crucial about the table tennis, Liam, was that it meant that we could, for instance, when I did the tour with Don Perry and I were assiduous practicers. I would practice scales and arpeggios for much of the day, and the table tennis was important to provide just a gap between practicing, because when you go on to play, it's that age old thing, you don't go on to continue practicing, you go on now to utilize whatever skill you've achieved through this practice and try to play music. And so it was important to put table tennis in before going to play, especially after having spent much of the day practicing. What was the second last
Second last one was talking about Terry Alice really being so upset after finishing whiskey during the Under Wraps sessions.
Yeah. No, Terry had I've spoken about this in a Sky documentary, and so is Dave Pegg. Terry was invited down to listen to Under Wraps for the first time, and unusually, we had not invited any critique by a record company prior to that. Oftentimes they might come down because they're interested in hearing what's going on. So it would be a work in progress. But this was the finished thing. And we were all, I think, and I'll certainly speak for myself, a little bit worried about it, because I think largely because it was still very mechanistic, still very machiney. I myself wanted to play, as I explained earlier, I wanted to play more than sequence or have a simulacrum of whatever acoustic instrument it would be. So I would have preferred real organ, real piano, blah, blah, blah. So we were a little bit nervous, but Terry came down and he was very, very late. And, you know, in an altered state at very least, due to, you know, bacchanalia of some sort or another. I think it was, I think it was probably alcohol. But he listened to the album, but due to his state, he'd put on his headphones in such a way that his neck, the left headphone was on his neck, and the right headphone was near his right ear, but not actually in it. So he wasn't listening to it terribly well anyway. And and his conclusion at the end of it, and he was very forthright, was to tell us in no uncertain terms that he thought it was shit. And he thought the album was crap. And I was offended mainly on behalf of Ian and Martin, who had been, and certainly Ian Anderson had been had gotten Chrysalis, Terry Ellis is the Ellis of the Chrysalis, Chris Wright and Terry Ellis, Chris Ellis. So Chrysalis, the record company, got off the ground largely thanks to Ian Anderson. So I thought that Terry was out of order, completely in every way, shape, and form out of order. However, that's not to say that his criticism wasn't valid, because we were all feeling, is this any good? And Dave Pegg was very upset with Terry Ellis in particular. Terry Ellis just took one look at me and wanted me to die, because he would blame me for all the synthesizers and stuff like that, and how Jethro Tull had come off the rails. He wanted another Thick as a Brick. That just doesn't happen if you're an artist that wants to keep creating. You just don't go, right, we've had Thick as a Brick, let's have another one. That's not the artistic temperament, certainly from those days. The creative mind wants to keep moving. Whether it was in the right direction or not, Liam, well, time has told us, and we accept these things inevitably. But Dave was offended at the time, and Terry's drink was modified. His parting drink was modified on his way out. That's as much as you need know.
That's fair enough. So the other question was, because I think we kind of covered that second one, that first one. So it's basically a choice between, do you like the Broadsword tour more, or did you like the Under Wraps tour more?
They all presented their highs and lows. In when I went on tour with Jethro Tull for the Broadsword, remember I was telling you, I mean, I was, the year before that I was playing in pubs and clubs in England, so I was happy as a dog with two winkies one way or another, and that was very nice. Jerry Conway, the drummer, who's a great groove drummer, but Jerry was suffering a little bit because the Jethro Tull gig, also it required a lot of the drummer, not just to be able to manifest groove, but big chops, because Barrymore Barlow was a sensational player, and so trying to cover all these bases was hard for Jerry, and it required energy and taste buds that perhaps Jerry didn't fully meet the criteria that perhaps was necessary for that particular tour. I personally love Jerry's playing, and he's a wonderful person. But for instance, in my case, I had to cover the abilities of Eddie Jobson and Dee Palmer and John Evan, and so these were certainly more classically oriented players than I am. I'm more of a jazzer, but I was happy to do so, and I think well able to do so. Others might not think the same, Liam, but I think I could do that, and I did. So I was very happy personally on Broadsword and the Beast. It was troublesome for Jerry, I think, but on the Under Wraps tour, then Don Perry, who was a phenomenal, is a phenomenal player, and can cover grooves and the big stuff and all the rest of it, and the chops related things. As I said, Don and I had a great working relationship, and we would practice a lot as I told you, prior to the gig. So it was just great. It was just like a workshop for me. But at the same time, as I said, we were encountering difficulties with Ian, understandably, who now had this difficulty with his voice, and it made some of the moments unpleasant.
Yeah, of course, Don Perry would go on to be the drummer on the late A's album's Crest of an Ave, which obviously, as you know, is the infamous Grammys winning album that bet Metallica and all that at the Grammys, and also Rock Island as well, which, as I mentioned earlier, you guest appeared on there and did a couple of tracks as well. So
yeah. Well, I thought the irony was delicious, and my view then as now, even although I've been out of Jethro Tull, as you know, for nearly 40 years, and so it's I can't tell you precisely how they might feel about this, but I thought the irony was utterly delicious, and the offense of fans of heavy metal and all the rest of it. I just think, well, come on, guys, get a sense of humor. This is great. And I thought what I thought what Chrysalis did, flute is a heavy metal instrument too. I thought that was I thought it was great. Personally, I thought it was good for all concerned, because it meant that there was a humor and a humility to the whole shebang that had actually disappeared over the years, because it gets so po-face, Liam. The whole thing can get everything about music and commercial music and playing and being and doing can get a bit po-faced, and in truth, we're humans. There has to be joy and happiness and fun and sometimes hilarity. I thought it was hilarious that they got a Grammy. Hilarious and well deserved.
indeed, the Crest of an Ave album is definitely fantastic. Houses one of my favorite songs from the era, Still Monkey. I think that is a fantastic single and was a great hit for American rock audiences.
Well, I mean, it's not for nothing that the cult of Ian Anderson has persisted to this day. He's a brilliant, he's a sensational human. I'm very, as I've said, I'd say it every time, I'm so grateful to Ian and Jethro Tull for, I say this, I wouldn't have got my start in real big time professional music without Jethro Tull, but I wouldn't have developed as a musician within Jethro Tull. So I'm super grateful. Ian was a great mentor to me, by the way. I wasn't much older than you when I joined Jethro Tull, and Ian took me under his wing one way or another. And he is a very cerebral person, a funny person. He's got the great blend of, he's serious when you have to get serious, but he's mighty funny when when not on camera. Just the great things that you would hope for what I consider to be Ian as a great, outstanding band leader.
Yes, I was when I was preparing myself for the for this podcast, I was watching over some of the Broadsword era live concerts. The one from Italy that was televised on the television. I
Oh yeah,
like the use of strobing lights and watching you, watching me. I think
yeah.
that sort of emulates the train that's passing by. How they had the lab coat men wandering with Ian on the stage.
Yes. Well, in truth, we both Ian and I in particular there was an artist called at the time very popular called Thomas Dolby. She blinded me with
Yeah.
science and that sort of thing, and I loved Thomas Dolby. Now, when I was talking to Ian then about Thomas Dolby, and I took Ian to see Thomas Dolby, and we loved it. Now, it's given just what I've said about Ian, about how funny and how serious he was, it's interesting to think that I think Thomas Dolby was, and of course he's changed his career, but I think Thomas Dolby at the time was both serious and funny. And that's what we wanted. I think that's what we were trying to get at with things like the lab coat men, and because we'd seen Thomas Dolby do this thing. He'd come on with a box on his head, or that's what we thought was Thomas Dolby. He had a box on his head, and it was a kind of a slightly magician's sleight of hand, because you thought it was Thomas Dolby, but it was somebody else, and Thomas Dolby was elsewhere on the stage. And we kind of ripped that idea a little bit, because at one point, after I think it was on the Under Wraps tour, or maybe it was Broadsword, I can't remember. And at the end of it, at the very end, Ian's doing the sort of acoustic part of To Be Thick as a Brick, and he's in silhouette behind the screen, and everybody thinks it's Ian that's singing this, because you see him in silhouette with the guitar and stuff, but actually he's gone into this box. He's hiding in a box elsewhere on the stage, and I can't remember what it's videoed, the concert. I can't remember which one it's from. Anyway, Ian pops out To Be Thick as a Brick, and he pops out of the box on the left hand side of the stage, when everybody's looking stage right. So we kind of it was Thomas Dolby that we loved at the time. I was also a big fan, not just of Thomas Dolby in this genre, but we all pursue several different types of music all at the same time. But in the electronica area, I also loved a band called Yellow Magic Orchestra at the time, and one of their members, and one of the reasons I loved all this was it was funny, but it also had Riichi Sakamoto as a piano player, as a sensational piano player, who went on to do the film score for what was it, The Last Emperor, and it was that Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Anyway, great. So it was, for me, both Thomas Dolby and Yellow Magic Orchestra had musical substance that perhaps things that, even though I love them, say Kraftwerk or some of the other seminal electronica type bands, maybe didn't have. For a musician like me, I know they were great, but YMO definitely had some serious musician component to it, and same with Thomas Dolby. There was some serious music going on as well as electronica.
I actually,
Sorry, that's
I
a
got
long
in.
answer.
I got in contact with Thomas Dolby recently. I'm thinking about getting him on the podcast as well, because I really admire him as a musician. He really brought forward the new sound of the synthwave era, and I think he's someone I really want to talk to on the podcast, much like you.
Well, thank you. And I imagine he would be. Well, I've seen him showing up on at least one TED talk. Of TED Talks, Liam.
Yes.
You've seen them, and I've seen him being a contributor to that. and looking back, I think he played a big role in the formation of what went on to be, some of the things that Ian and I were trying to get to with the usage of electronica, but combining that with playing, and it's called fusion. There's different fusions. There used to be jazz rock and which was eventually called fusion. But it's fusion music is hard to pull off, and I thought, for instance, when looking back on Under Wraps and Walk Into Light, I tend to invoke that thing that they said at the end of the Apollo 13 failed moon mission. They called it a successful failure. So I think that Under Wraps, to a certain extent, and Walk Into Light were successful failures or failing successes, or something like that. But Thomas Dolby, to get back to, would be a great contributor, I'm sure, to you. He's also a super intelligent guy.
Yeah.
And these are the other defining qualities of the music I tend to gravitate to. That it has, some intelligence to it. Not elite. This is not elitism. I just prefer if there's more substance to it than bubblegum.
Yeah.
That's my own taste. You would expect that now that I'm, ancient.
Well, I agree with your opinions as well. I'm much towards that sort of intelligence in music and that sort of synth wavy type of stuff. So I definitely agree with you on that aspect. Moving on from Tull now. So now we're getting past Tull. So no more Tull from here. So you worked with one of my favorite synth pop bands besides Thomas Dolby, Go West.
Oh yeah.
So you have a bit of a friendship with Peter Cox.
That's right.
The lead singer.
That's right. Well, here, it leads on very. It's apropos of what I was just saying, that Go West came about at a time when the genre-specific nature of the business was beginning to congeal a little bit, where something could either be good or bad for apparently belonging to a specific type of music making, and it was dismissively called Blue Eyes Soul. But Peter Cox and Richard Drummie were both, and I've got more experience of Peter, both complicated and super intelligent, in my view. So they have an approach to the music that is demanding of themselves and demanding of the music. And so it was great. When I left Jethro Tull, for instance, I received, thank you. My wife just brought me a glass of water.
Nice.
Because she's had to listen to me waffling for the last hour or so. I do apologise to your listeners for the waffle. But when I left Jethro Tull, I received, leaving on the last tour, I received a telegram from a guitar player whose name is Jeff Beck, and he wanted me to go and play with his band. And Jeff Beck is, which I did for 5 weeks. It didn't go anywhere, but Jeff Beck is amongst the most outstanding British guitar players of my generation. And it led to a style of guitar playing in subsequent years that was performed by Alan Murphy, who was also a member of Go West. Now, I was then, after leaving Jethro Tull, I did some trade fairs playing at these, how they have the NAMM booth and all the rest of it. And I would be doing trade fairs like this. And a guy came up to me when I was playing in one of these trade fairs and said, are you in level 42? Because I was playing a level 42 tune at the time called Heathrow. And I said, no. And he said, I got to introduce you to these guys. And he introduced me to a band called SFX. And in that band was Tony Beard, Alan Murphy, Felix Kirsch, a brilliant keyboard player called Richard Cottle. And he introduced me to these guys, and what he wanted to do, what's this guy that introduced me to SFX, he wanted us, with the exception of Richard Cottle, who was busy doing something else, he wanted us to go and demonstrate various Fender label equipment. So, Rogers drums, and I had the Rhodes Chroma to demonstrate, and Fender guitars, Fender basses, Fender amplifiers. So we started touring. Tony Beard was the drummer. And we started touring as this trade show band and demonstrating Fender and Rogers and Chroma equipment. And then Alan Murphy had been playing with Peter Cox and Richard Drummie in the first lineup of Go West. And when Dave West, who was the keyboard player originally in Go West, when Dave West couldn't make it because he and Gary Stevenson, the producer of the first album, went off to do their own solo album, Radar it was called. Alan Murphy introduced me to Pete and Richard, and I joined Go West. I joined them on the tour. When they were, let me get this right, see if I've got this right. My memory will be hazy here. We were doing a film, what was it? It was Rocky IV. We did music for Rocky IV. And so we were in LA doing this music for Rocky IV at the time. And so I got to meet Sylvester Stallone and so on. And that's how I got to meet the Go West boys. And then I produced Go West's last single before they split up. Well, I thought it was going to be the last single, but then they split up. I think I've got the chronology of this right. And Pete and Richard went their own separate ways, but came back together again they got a kick of the ball on Pretty Woman when they did King of Wishful Thinking.
Yes.
That was produced by Peter Wolf. It's a great song. And then Pete came to me to ask me to produce and co-write his solo album, which I did. And we had that was done in LA. So that's and Alan Murphy and Tony Beard. Well, Alan Murphy was one of the most sensational musicians that I've ever worked with. A beautiful man. Sadly, died of AIDS. He was also in Level 42 briefly.
Yes.
Yeah. A sensational player, a beautiful man. And Tony, I've stayed in touch with Tony Beard on and off throughout the years. And I've stayed in touch with Pino Palladino on and off throughout the years. I've done a few albums with Pino. So there's these people, they coalesce around all these good guys, not by just being friends of the stars, but by, birds of a feather. We all gather around the good things, I think. It's a silly thing to say, but that's an opinion.
You also, I think you forgot to mention, you did some work as an acoustic grand piano player on Dancing on the Couch, which was their second album, 1987. So you finally had a shot at playing an acoustic grand piano at a 1980s album.
That's right. So they said to me, I went out to, it's no longer there, it was burnt down, but I went out to Puck Studios in Denmark, and we were vibing things. I think it was Pino there, and we were vibing some things, and they had this song called The King is Dead, which they reckon sounded a bit jazzy. And so Gary Stevenson said to me, can you go out and play a bit like, who's that guy that did, you could only bring one jazz piano player to mind. And I knew he was going to say Dave Brubeck. So I said, McCoy Tyner. Now, McCoy Tyner is a huge hero of mine. He's no longer with us. And McCoy Tyner is a very jagged fourths, plays fourths that you'd know the shape and the sound if you heard it. And a sensational player. So I said, "Oh, McCoy Tyner, play it like McCoy Tyner," and they went, "Yeah, play it like McCoy, whatever his name is." So I was going, "Oh, great." So they did want me to play in a sort of jagged style. That's why it's got that kind of jaggedy edge to it. But yes, I did go out and play on Dancing on the Couch, and but a lot of the recorded material for Go West at that time was manifest by a lot of the keyboard playing was manifest by Dave West, who was a great technician vibe. But actually, it was Gary Stevenson and Dave in concert with one another. The great minds, and of course, in concert with Peter Cox and Richard Drummond. This thing about birds of a feather, the meeting of minds and all. But yes, it was great for me to go out, and I played on a few more things and so on and so forth.
In the same year, you had an encounter with Paul McCartney.
That's right. You're well researched, Liam.
Yes, I am.
Well, I'd been working with I'd been brought down to, let me see, get the chronology of this right. Because I was in London, I was a session player at this time, and I would be one of the guys that you call up and you go down, and anything that was put in front of me, or anything that I had to play, I could play. And so I got to be known as one of the guys that would be able to play something if you called them. There was at the time, I guess there was about 5 or 6 of these guys, Richard Cottle being one of them, Jess Bailey being another. So we would all be a good bet to be able to, turn up and do something worthwhile. So I was approached by a great arranger. I think he's a fantastic arranger that had been working with Trevor Horn and Steve Lipson during the Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Grace Jones epoch. And his name is Richard Niles. And Richard got in touch with me to be in his big band called Bandzilla, where we were the house band for one of the seminal, a bit like an American late night talk show type, the Ruby Wax Show, it was called. And Richard and I got on famously. And so around about the time, Paul McCartney, let's get this right. At the same time, there was an American producer called Phil Ramone that had produced, amongst other things, Billy Joel. And Phil Ramone was tapped as going to be the new producer for Paul McCartney. And when Phil Ramone came into town, there was an ad that went out to the various session agencies that Phil and Paul wanted to audition all the bad cats in London, in their various disciplines. Myself on piano and keyboards. There's loads of people showed up to this studio. I think it was Rack that we went to. I can't remember now. And Phil Ramone and Paul were there listening to, these ensembles that get put together on each day. I was in an ensemble with Lawrence Cottle, who was Richard Cottle's brother on bass, a sensational player. I can't remember who was on drums. Anyway, they would say, okay, play High, 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 which was a Paul McCartney tune, play it in the style of a reggae tune. And we'd all have to try and quickly, play it in the style of reggae. Now do some ballad, do it as a rock and roll thing or whatever it would be. Anyway, I liked Paul, and Paul, I think, liked me. Phil Ramone liked me. And Phil went to work with Paul producing a new album, and then for whatever reason, it didn't work out with Paul McCartney. But during that time, Paul had become aware of this arranger called Richard Niles, who I worked with, and I'd been working with in Bandzilla. and Richard asked me to go down to Paul's house because Paul was going to be refurbishing Wings tracks that hadn't made the Wings albums, but he thought were too good to lose in totality, and maybe to replace some of the keyboards that either he or Linda had done. So this is when Linda was alive. So I went down to Paul's studio in Hastings to play on, take some of the things off that he'd done. It's all on, 2-inch multi-track analog tape, and I'd replay them, maybe play them a bit better or bring them up to date as it was seen at the time. And what's the story I like to tell was that that in meeting Paul, I got to, a boyhood dream was fulfilled, because when I was around about 7, I was writing these Beatle-y songs because I loved the Beatles, and my mum and dad sent a tape of my songs with me singing my songs, one of which was called "Fred is Dead." Sounds like a hit to me. So they sent this tape when I was 7 to the Beatles, and I never did hear back from them. Anyway, all these years later, and I'm playing in the studio with Paul McCartney, and I said to Paul, Paul, when I was 7, I sent you a tape and you never replied. And he went out into the sort of kitchen area of the studio, and at that point, the post came, and he came back into the studio with a jiffy bag, and he said, "Peter, your tape's just arrived," which of course was not true, but it was very nice of him to
Think of you.
to string me along. Anyway, I months later I was in New York. I was doing keyboards for a band called Foreigner. I was playing on the Inside Information album, and Paul's then manager Richard Ogden phoned me up and asked if I would be interested in joining Wings at the time, or at least I was under consideration, myself and another keyboard player, and Richard Ogden was sounding me out as to whether I would be interested in joining Wings. I wasn't interested, really, because I'd already, and this is my post-rationalized view, I'd already experienced the great thing of working with Paul, and meeting him, holding the bass guitar, being in his presence. I'd already had the great thing. My own desire was to continue playing with as many people as I could, as many different people as I could at that time. It wasn't that I was not interested. Of course, I said to Richard Ogden, could you give me a few days to think about that? But understandably, you don't. He's not going to call me up again, because I'm considering whether or not I want to join Wings. And anyway, Paul McCartney went on to get a fabulous keyboard player called Wix that does the gig incredibly well, and he's the right thing. I was much more into pursuing my own, getting my own voice, as they say, together. It's always been like that. Them's the breaks, Liam.
Yeah, there you go, indeed. You've worked with another Scot as well, Annie Lennox, on the Diva album in 1991. What was it like working with another Scot in the studio?
Well, it came about. It came about as again. These are all just. They form part of a continuum, Liam. Is that at the end of the 80s, I started to work with a fellow called Steve Lipson, who was then known as Trevor Horn's engineer. And Steve and I had done the second Frankie Goes to Hollywood album. And then Steve was invited to produce a band called Simple Minds, a Scottish band, which he did, and he invited me to. By that time, their keyboard player had left, so he invited me to play keyboards for Simple Minds on their album Real Life. And as a result of that, I had a very good working relationship with Steve, and it has to be good because the much of the creation of, by this time, the creation of the identities of these albums and with these artists involves me investing, arrangements and songwriting and not just playing. So when he asked me in to work with Annie Lennox, I was delighted, of course. And Annie was finding her feet out of the Eurythmics. She'd been in a band called the Eurythmics, of course, and this was, in my view, an outpouring of some of the frustrations she may have felt, and some of the creative outlet that she needed, she needed to have by that time, having been, with Dave Stewart all these years. So no, it was that was a great album to participate in. In fact, I'm doing it's being broadcast on a Sky, the TV channel, in 2 weeks' time now. I tell the story of how I got Walking on Broken Glass together in the studio, because Annie played me a demo that was quite different from the way it turned out. I came up with the string arrangement and so on. And so that was on working on Diva, and then they brought me back in to work with her on Medusa. But by that time, I was so busy at the time. I only worked on No More I Love Yous and one other song. And then Annie also got me back in on her Bear album. So I've worked on the 3 Annie Lennox solo albums. And of course, I was Grammy nominated for my arrangement on Walking on Broken Glass on the Diva album, amongst other things. And I co-wrote Legend in My Living Room and all that sort of malarkey, Liam.
Yeah.
You know what happens.
That's how it is. One artist I've always felt that you could have worked with easily if you had the chance was the Alan Parsons Project. I felt that the 80s sound, when they had the success with Eye in the Sky moving on towards Ammonia Avenue and Stereotomy, I felt the synth and sort of sound production of the time is something that you could have done had you had the chance and the offer to work with Alan Parsons.
That because what I'm explaining to you, Liam, is that a continuum is that it's possible to look back as you're doing and thinking that I would be suitable, or would have been a good fit for something like that. But in truth, 2 things weren't there. Me and the world. That's to say, the me that I am now wasn't there back then, and the world, as viewed now, wasn't there then. So I never thought that the Alan Parsons thing was a thing for me. I had different aspirations and ambition. It was never to do the thing that seemed appropriate for the time, because I was always reaching for, trying to find something else, trying to get forward. So it seems like it would have been a good fit then, but it wouldn't have been a good fit because I was desperately trying to move what I saw forward as evolve as a person and as a musician. So although there's nothing, it's a good observation on your behalf, and nothing against the Alan Parsons various projects, which have been fabulously successful, but that was never in my sights. In fact, that old thing of a man's grasp should be out with his or her reach. The thing, it's always the thing that's over the hill, that's over the next hill, or over the next horizon. That's the stuff that I've always wanted to get to. So it's a continuum, a flow. You see what I mean?
Yeah. You mentioned part is single from a band called Marillion, so that second wave of prog rock.
Yeah. I did a festival. It was one of the last festivals I did with Jethro Tull because Ian Anderson had kind of championed the cause of Marillion. And we did this Theakston's Festival and got Marillion, who were then unknown, to be our support band. Did you know that, Liam?
I don't think even Marillion's ever mentioned it about
Yeah.
you guys. So
Ian thought that Marillion were great and insisted that they come and be support on this Theakston's Festival for us. And then I in the 90s, I did an album up in Scotland at Fish's studio. He had a studio in Haddington, and I met Fish then and his then wife, I think. It's all very interesting.
yeah, because honestly, I love Marillion's music and how they were sort of embracing what Genesis had put out in the 70s, and they were trying to translate it into the 80s sound, and they were constantly compared to Genesis, being like a
Yeah.
poor man's Genesis when they were just trying to bring back what was great of the 1970s.
Well, that's right. There's a phrase I'm trying to bring to mind by is it Voltaire? But anyway, tradition's only good if you can add something to it, and I would agree that Marillion were maybe inspired by those kind of what they would view then as a traditional genre in terms of like Genesis or something, and then bring something new to it. I mean, they brought into that area, they brought the song format. There was obviously the huge hit Kaylee,
Yes.
but it had a lot of music in it, didn't it? I mean, by that time though, Liam, I have to say also I had departed from that area of, that was not my area of, that's not what I was looking at. My thing, but my taste buds took me much more towards, and my hero is Joe Zawinul of a band called Weather Report. So it was my own desires were entirely different from some of the music that I have participated in, that sounds as if that's my desire, but those were not necessarily, those are things that I maybe could play to a certain extent, and I played them with maximum commitment. But along the way, I've my thing has been much more of a fusion or a jazz thing probably.
Mm. A question that would be interesting to ask would be about virtual workstations, so VST, so emulation of vintage instruments.
It's a very complex issue. Now I'm doing a duo gig at the moment. It's, it's as an aside really, but I'm doing it with a percussionist called Pete Lockett, who's an expert in an Indian tabla percussion form called conical. It's very, very hard rhythmically to the Western ear to feel initially, but I had to make the call about whether to go along the Ableton route and have virtual instruments, or whether I would go the hardware route and have the sort of reintroduce the racks and racks of keyboards. I'm almost tempted to don my cape again. And so I've chosen to go along the hardware route rather than the virtual instrument route. But in my career, early on, I was an early adopter of, well, what was once Sound Tools and then became Pro Tools. And when Pro Tools started to allow, or Logic started to allow these virtual instruments, they've become incredibly great over that period of time. I've lived through when they weren't great or when they didn't even exist, and they weren't great for a long time. And then computers weren't quite up to it, and it was crashy and this, that, and the other. And so you were better off with a piece of hardware. But I've made the choice, as I say, recently. My studio setup is predicated on Pro Tools and loads of software, virtual instruments. But my live for doing this gig with Pete Lockett, and the next one's in August, is that I have hardware. One, two. Well, I have as my main keyboard a Korg Kronos, an 88, and then I have a sequential circuits Prophet 6, and then I have I've forgotten the name of it now. Yeah, I'll send you pictures of it, Liam. Got the name of it. I've also got a Rolly, a Seaboard, which I love. I love that thing. It's a great player, the Marco Parisi, sensational. One of the young guys that I think is a great. He would be a great. He's somebody great for you to interview as well. So these are all instruments that are obviously hardware. The Prophet 6 is very much, I tried that out against things like, because I forgot to mention, I still kept my Prophet 5 as well.
Ooh.
Yes,
I do like the Prophets as well. They are very nice instruments from the 80s.
But that Prophet 6 is incredibly good, and I like the key bed. It's a sensational instrument, but I've kept my Prophet 5 anyway. But it's like my DX7. It's not going anywhere. I'll probably have to be buried with that thing. Or I'll think about leaving it to you, Liam. But not for very long.
I can just imagine your burial site is going to be massive, because it's going to be your casket, but then it's going to be all your desired keyboards that are going to be on the sides as well.
That's right, and I want to be. I also want to. I'll want to be buried beside my doggy. I wonder if you can see.
Let's have a look.
Can you see that? Look, can you see that doggy?
Yeah, I think I can see him somewhere.
Yeah, on the seat. It's
yeah.
she's having she's sleeping. That's Phoebe. So I want to wherever Phoebe is, I'll want to be, and then you can tip in the Prophet 5 and the DX7 and the CS80 all afterwards. Yeah.
Unless you want to give them to me, honestly.
That's what I said. I'd no, I know. I said I'd consider that, but for a very short time.
Mm-hmm. Like, honestly, if it's down to the boil of it, I would love to protect what was yours, honestly, to carry on the legacy.
Oh, I don't know if I'm going to leave a legacy. I'm not much of a believer in that, Liam.
No. Well, you definitely, what with Tull sound in the 1980s, you definitely influenced the change of what came about in Under Wraps, and definitely in Walk and Light, experimenting with electronic sounds that, frankly, other members wouldn't bold to touch.
That's right. I mean, the Jethro Tull community is, I think, justifiably incensed some of the time that it didn't sound like Jethro Tull of yore. But I always say, Ian's temperament was to keep pushing, and to adapt, and survive one way or another. And I was only happy to assist in whichever way I could. And actually, the return to a slightly more traditional sound is something of a rapprochement, or it's a bit revisionist for my taste now, because I think ultimately, Liam, the way forward actually lies forward. But you can take, you can take from the past. You can borrow these things from the past, but you have to add something new, I think, for it to stay alive.
Exactly. Otherwise, it's just going to die out.
Yeah, and so you take from the past and then you add something to it, and the whole thing stays alive. But ultimately, it will morph in such a way as to be unrecognizable. And that's one of the things in the modern world. There's a modern artist that so-called modern artist that I like, pop artist, Laura Mvula, and her latest album it sounds a little bit like, it's got funky Nile Rodgers type guitars, and it's got synthesizers, and they're trying to add something new to it, but you can just get too tied up with the past. I believe in moving the dial a little bit if we can, and that's, I think, if I've not that I've done this intentionally. I don't think the first motivation is to move the dial, but I think, for instance, there are a few words, and one in particular I think it should be an honorific word, but the idea of going along and thinking that something's cool is, I don't think, a particularly good emotion. If other people think it's cool, that's good. But if you're doing it to be cool, I don't think that's good, because that means you're conforming in some way with the normativity of what's considered cool at the time. So when I look back on Jethro Tull and trying to do whatever I was doing, it was never to be cool or to do the thing that I thought is the right thing to do. It was simply Ian and I just moving forward in some way. And maybe it moves the dial. And maybe it moves the dial in the wrong direction. But it doesn't it doesn't matter. This whole idea of movement is, and it's one of the things that connotes activity. When we stop moving, as old people and then dead people, you can recognize the dead from the alive, because the alive thing's moving, and that's what I feel is as a necessity for music and living.
Yeah. Has Martin Barr ever approached you about working with his band live, like touring with him in his live band?
Yeah. And initially, when Martin asked me if way back, can't remember how long ago, he'd asked me if I'd be interested. And he's a sensational player and a wonderful man as well, a great fella. But this was not my thing. I wouldn't have been able to add anything to that, I don't think. And I think the thing that he's doing now is lovely, because he's got Dee Palmer.
Yeah.
And that's so nice. And I think that's a good combo. And I've stayed in touch a little bit with Dee Palmer, because she's again, she was a phenomenal influence in Jethro Tull.
Yeah.
I mean, you ought to. And I'm not ought. You can't derive an ought from an is, but Dee would be a great person to interview, I think, Liam,
Yes.
for you.
We have John Evan here in Australia. He currently lives here in Australia, but he can't be contacted at all because he's worried about how many Tull fans will approach him on the street.
Oh, really?
Tull's very popular here in Australia, and if he gets recognised, he'll probably lose his marbles.
Right. Well, of course, that's presuming he had marbles to lose in the first place. I'm just kidding. No, I can understand any nervousness, and I mean, I'm occasionally nervous about about commenting on Jethro Tull. I mean, I've got a fair few people that consider me the Beelzebub on the basis of having brought all this synthetic sequencing and fiddle-dee-dee to the whole thing. But as I say that, and I've said it repeatedly, this was Ian's desire. I could do it, but it was his desire.
They should really be blaming him, not you.
Well, blame the artistic temperament, the desire to keep moving. That's what I think it is. And that's all good.
Yeah.
I believe.
I'll definitely keep Dee in mind. I'll see if there's a possible contact with her, and I'll tell her that you mentioned her, and definitely talk about it.
There's so much to be gained from speaking to Dee, because really, in relation to Jethro Tull, remember, when I look back on it, I really was passing through Liam.
Yeah.
Even though it was great, but my passage was through Jethro Tull, and this was the way in which I thought I could I could get to be a musician on a larger scale than I had. This is the truth, on a larger scale than I had been playing in pubs and clubs in Scotland, and it's very true that that happened. But I was very, very happy, as I've told you, to play the music of Jethro Tull with the maximum integrity that I could bring to bear, and playing the parts that Dee and John had played. It was important to me to play them with commitment and gusto and vigor and love. I
Mm.
do believe I did that.
Yeah. As a quick top five songs that you played live from the past era Jethro Tull on stage. Like, what were your favorites that you played on the live sets?
I enjoyed. Let me see. There was a version of Songs from the Wood that I liked playing a lot because it was bloody hard. We do the piano part, the double-handed, double octave. Yeah. So I enjoyed playing that. I enjoyed, of course, playing Black Sunday for the Funny Time Bars. Um, um, let me see. Some most of the so-called big songs like Aqualung and Too Old to Rock and Roll and stuff like that, I only encountered them as a sort of sweaty mass of, uh, of protein and fat at the end of a concert. So I never liked playing them very much. Because it was always just, by that time it was just, I was exhausted anyway, and Ian must have been terribly exhausted. So I preferred the more cerebral size to that. The thing I enjoyed playing most of all, I suppose, is that when I can't remember which epoch it was in Jethro Tull, but I came up with an arrangement for playing live, living in the past. And it was we thought it was interesting, and I thought it was interesting to play the melody of Living in the Past in 5, which it is, but to have the drums in 4. So dun, 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 1. So the snare goes on to 1, but play boom, dun, 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 ba, 1. There's 1. It's the snare, but then it comes round again back to the bass drum. So and then I did this whole big arrangement for the live thing, which I had one of those. I wish I hadn't seen it. I'd gone to see Ian. It must be 10 or more years ago, and they were playing in a tent in a doing one of these small festivals and stuff, and they were still doing that arrangement of that I'd done all these years ago of Living in the Past. But it was, I think it's still, it was still good because I don't know if anybody remembers them. Any of the Jethro Tull fans might remember it, but it had energy and zestiness about it, simply because it was, the 5 over, 5 over 4. Or that's one of the reasons, at least.
I always enjoyed your take on Minstrel in the Gallery in 1982. You simplified sort of the song at the time, which was getting sort of harder for Ian Anderson to play in his original key. So it's put down a key, even at the start of Songs from the Woods still. It had been in that key for a while.
Yeah. Well, more your memory. I mean, I haven't brought this to mind for nearly 40 years now, Liam. So you must know more about this than I do now. But I enjoyed playing. What was the song you were doing?
Minstrel in the Gallery from 1975.
Oh yeah, I came up with that. It didn't went into something else, but yeah, that was a great riff,
Yes.
wasn't it? It's a great riff. You see, that's not a million miles away from metal.
I know.
It's a great riff, and one thing that metal has got going for it on occasion, it's like all these genres have some kind of USP, and metal can produce some stunningly great riffs. Well, that's a great riff, but I can bring it to mind as if it were yesterday. Yeah, that was good fun to do.
Yeah,
All
Minstrel
good.
Gallery, and definitely, like you said early on, like definitely when you played the hit the sort of popular stuff, you were like not wanting to do it. But Hunting Girl was played earlier in the sets for Under Wraps tour.
Yeah, that's right. Well, actually, it was during Hunting Girl in the Universal Amphitheatre in LA that I decided that my tenure in Jethro Tull was over. And that was the famous night where Ian, was having a terrible time with his throat. And there were people in the front row that were spliffing up and smoking weed. And it was really aggravating his throat. And it was at the beginning of Hunting Girl. And it was at Hunting Girl. So again, a great riff. So we went out and started playing, and so. Now, what Ian had, I don't know if you've seen this, but he had a button on stage that started a tape machine, and on the tape machine was the sound of a riding crop whacking somebody's bottom, right? So it was important that Ian, who is out front and he's engaging, he's putting a lot of effort in. So the one thing you're not doing is counting, right? You're not counting where you are. It's understandable. So the riff, Ian's got in a bad mood on this night, and the riff's going. I'll sing it in a different key. One day across the field. Right. So where that is in the bar, it's quite complicated because it was a timed switch that was right. 1, 2, 3, back. So he, in the front of his home crowd for the very first time, Don Perry launched into, instead of going da 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 ba da ba da 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 ba da 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 ba ba da da, right, instead of doing that, Don Perry launched into an oh my god amongously polyrhythmic fabulous multiple, I don't know what was going on, so but I could concentrate because I could go instantly. If he was going to start doing something weird, I would start counting. So he went da 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 day across, and Ian pressed the tape button in the wrong place. But Ian, being Ian, continued to sing about, it would be about 7/8 notes away from where reality was taking place, sadly. And so we continued on in the right place. Ian was in the wrong place, and he continued on. And then we all made each individual attempts to get to where Ian was in the bar. And subsequently, it sounded shambolic, of course. In the meantime, the follow spot followed Ian across the monitors and into the audience, and he was. I saw these tins of weed and smoking paraphernalia jump up in the air as Ian, did he, whack this geezer around the chops for having the temerity to come and enjoy himself. And and then he came back up on the stage, stopped the band, and then he shouted he shouted into the audience, to stop annoying him, and and he shouted with such gusto he blew what was left of his voice. and he was really struggling for the rest of that concert. And the rest of that concert was just plain ugly. It was horrible, and I thought, nah, that's no good. Sadly, for me, Keyboard magazine, in which I'd come second in the international keyboard playing polls, had turned up that night to interview me. And after such a shambolic gig, that didn't happen. And I thought, well, that's that then. I didn't. I thought Ian was justified, but it was silly, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to go through anything like that again. I've gone on record now with you and other places. This is the artistic temperament of which I possess plenty of myself. But after all these years of performing and so on and so forth, my idealized Ian Anderson would not have destroyed his voice this way, and certainly not on that occasion. And selfishly, it may have changed the outcome. It may have changed unfolding history, because I decided that was it for me and Jethro Tull. I'm sorry to tell you.
Yeah, I often think about how sore Dave Pegg's butt must be after every night getting smacked by that riding crop in Hunter Girl.
And you've seen that.
I've seen
happen,
the footage from it, from the
Yeah.
New Jersey concert in 1984, where he gets smacked on the bottom by it. I'm like, I wonder how Reddy's butt must be.
Well, I mean, Dave was also well able to numb whatever pain was going to ensue from being whacked on the bottom by a riding crop anyway. So it was during the course of the gig, for that matter, so it was fine. By the way, I have to tell you that that when Marillion supported us at that Theakston's festival, it was my first time dressed as a bush, trying to do. So this would be another favourite of mine, Jack in the Green. I don't think there's any footage of that, but I was, for that particular tour, in Jack in the Green, I had to go off stage, dress up as a bush, and then find my way across the stage to show up behind a park bench in time for "Have you seen Jack in the Green?" And then the follow spot would come on behind the bench, and there I would be, dressed as a bush, but with a keytar in my hands, playing the flute line. Sadly, on that gig, that Theakston's gig, which was an unrehearsed first attempt to do that, I hadn't realised that, or nobody had realised that, to fully complement looking like a bush, I put on the bush costume, but it also had a bush hat, or like a balaclava with leaves on it, and it meant that I had to wear it, but I couldn't put my specs back on.
Oh.
Which meant that I had to make my way across a darkened stage, and I'm very, very short-sighted. And so when the follow spot came on to "Have you seen Jack in the Green?" the follow spot came on behind the bench. I was nowhere near the bench because I'd fallen into the drum kit.
Oh. Oh my God.
These are all the things that you wouldn't know unless I told you, Leo. These are just things that pass people by. I've made sacrifices for Jethro Tull.
You mentioned that
Ian's not the only one.
Yeah, you too, as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned that keytar. I've seen like pictures of it. It's like a yellow keytar. I saw it on the Broadsword tour. Was that made by Yamaha?
No, that was made by my brother-in-law.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was a Roland SH09 synth, and he'd taken the keyboard off that. He built a guitar body, Brian May style. It weighed a ton.
Oh.
It was solid wood. It was huge and it was solid. And he put the keyboard of an Roland SH109, and I dutifully came out and waggled with gay abandon whenever the set allowed.
I've got a Lucenia X9, which is from like 2014, around about. Great sounds. and I absolutely love it when I play my keyboards.
Yeah, well, what I did ultimately, I don't know if you saw that, but I got I thought at the time, remember, it became a bit hackneyed, to see all these nonsense with with their capes and keytars and stuff at the time, of which I was one. And I thought, what can I do? What can I do that's different in this regard? So I got one of those little Yamaha, tiny little Yamaha keyboards with a what do you call it, a slide, a finger slide thing,
Mm.
and a volume control. And I put a cello spike on it around the back. So I played it in this. I played it in this sitting down like it was a cello. So the
Yep.
keyboard would be vertical and so holding it like that. And I did that on the I suppose that would be the Under Wraps tour, but by the time I started doing that malarkey, I thought it was in some way an interesting take on the thing. Also, the fact that on the stadium gigs that we had a ramp that would go out the front of the stage. They built, Kenny and Dave Morris built a remote control chair that would motorized chair that would go down to the end of the ramp, um, and then I would follow it with my cello spiked remote keyboard, and then sit on the chair and play the blues as best I could. And of course, there was much hilarity about, because they would move the chair when I was about to, because they could remote control. They would move it when I was about to sit down on it. So there was many a night where when I was flat on my arse, which is at least in contrast to the many of the night that I found myself flat on my face. But that's a different story.
Mm. Let's see. There's another track that I know of called "Something's on the Move" from Stormwatch. Do you have any sort of memories playing that one on Broadsword and the Beast tour?
None.
No, that's a shame. That's a really great song from the album. I thoroughly enjoy Stormwatch, and I think it's probably one of the best coming out from that final 70s album, thinking of myself. You also played Bungle in the Jungle like a one-off in Germany somewhere as well.
Wow. You know more about this than I can ever know now.
I know. It's surprising what a 19-year-old who likes only old music, yes,
Yeah,
I do not like anything else besides old music, can pretty much research and retain.
yeah. Well, I mean, as I said to you, the me now wasn't there then, and the world now wasn't there then. So you're witnessing it from a different perspective. But if you tell me I played it, I must have played it. But I have no memory. I have no memory of doing that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
See, most of
there's,
my career, Liam, has been spent outside of Jethro Tull. And all the things that I've done. I worked with a few more contemporary artists. Sia, for instance, I worked with. I mean, she's a contemporary artist,
yes, she
Australian
is.
artist.
She is. She's
Yeah,
Australian.
yeah, she's great. And a few more pop artists from Australia, such as Tina Arena, and these. So these are the things I've done along. I've done so many albums since there's so much music between me now and then in Jethro Tull that I can't bring back to mind some of the individual spots you're talking about. Bungle in the Jungle. What?
That was the War Child at era 1974. That was like the big
Right.
hit from the album.
All right. Yeah, I do remember seeing that maybe on a set list. By the way, I thought that was it often comes into criticism by some of the Jethro Tull aficionados, but I think that was a very productive stage for my taste for Jethro Tull. I thought Stormwatch had had great things on it. Um, I thought it was very productive for them. There seemed to be something going on. They were responding. Of course, all the other stuff was prior to that was largely sensational as well. But I did like Stormwatch.
Mm. I think it's been also, I think, in my view, it's kind of like the most Scottish album because it dealt with issues that were up in Scotland, with the oil and everything, and North Sea Oil, Donegal, which is the old ruins on the Isle of Skye. I love that song, by the way. I got
Ah,
Joshua Band to perform it for me at one of his gigs. Sounds so
oh,
great.
lovely, lovely. I went early in my tenure of Jethro Tull, and Ian invited me up to the Isle of Skye, to his house in the Isle of Skye, when we were vibing more things for Broadsword and the Beast, and things like Seal Driver, and they have their tendrils in the that Scottish, southern northern islands, the tough set of circumstances that fishermen have to endure, and then of course at the time Ian was becoming a salmon farmer because he had salmon cages up in an inlet in the Isle of Skye. So he would travel up there to preside over that every now and then. He had a lovely house up there in his little studio there. So I went up to work with him there, in the Isle of Skye, and go. He loved walking up the Coolin mountains and then going to there was a peat bog that he was always very interested in. Is a bog and largely comprised of peat, squelchy soil, and the just he said, "Come with me, and we'll stare the gale in the teeth." So, so for a pampered a southern type like myself to have to stare this gale, this bitterly cold gale in the teeth, which was Ian's pleasure. And I was trying to learn from this, but I'm not sure what I learned, and it was pretty horrible.
Mm. So Broadsword and the Beast is set to have a deluxe release. I think it's next year. Ian Anderson was talking about a whole bunch of demos that had just been discovered recently. Do you have any word on anything else that might be coming with the album?
Sadly, Liam, I don't follow the waft and the weave as far as Jethro Tull is concerned. All I can tell you is that, and I would never let it go, is that I have the outtakes, a tape of the outtakes of Broadsword and the Beast, which nobody. It's also coming to my grave. There are outtakes of the songs and the riotous humor that would take place in between. It's a great tape, but I could let nobody hear it. It's very private.
Not even Ian?
Ian knows Ian would know what's on it, and but it's highly personal. Nothing incriminating, but it's a very personal thing. It's the nothing nasty or anything deviant in any way. It's just that it's personalized. It's the subjective experience of us all from the period, and that would. I mean, if Ian's got them, and Ian might have them, and he might publish them. I don't think it's. It wouldn't be right for me to do it, but I've got some great outtakes of trying to get to the end of a song called Flying Colours from Broadsword. It's just sensational stuff. And then when I was doing, was it Slow Marching Band, I launched into a song in praise of our then T-boy, Lee Mantle, that culminates in, some fairly expressive language. Let's put it that way.
Because I thought maybe you might be writing some in the notes, maybe for that booklet that comes with all the box sets talking about how you made some of the tracks and that. But obviously, maybe you might have some demos that maybe Ian Anderson doesn't have of other songs, like rare songs, maybe even as well.
Well, for whatever reason, and I can never feel assured that they are good reasons, but as Ian's largely omitted me from much of the reportage. I was omitted in. I wasn't interviewed for the Ballad of Jethro Tull, the book. In talking to a New Day magazine, they've spoken to everybody that's been in Jethro Tull with the exception of me, and
What?
now they've got me. Yeah,
The
and
fuck is that?
I don't know. I don't. Ian doesn't seem terribly keen on my perspective, and I think it's kind of justified in a way. I've I've gone on to forge a career outside Jethro Tull that was more successful than being in Jethro Tull, and it's no biggie. I don't know if that's the reason, but he's not wanted me to. It seems to make much comment on the thing, but nonetheless, as I've said to you at the beginning of the interview, I have great respect for Ian, and I would be careful myself in being of letting Ian know if there was anything untoward that was going to be sneaked out or anything like that. And I'm not interested in those things. He's at liberty to contact me though, and I would be very happy to hear from him. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm.
I have done, by the way, a few years ago, and I was doing yet to be completed, and it's unfortunately there's the thrust for Scottish independence has kind of inserted itself into this. But I was doing an album. I was going on my own of doing Scottish songs with the Scottish artists that I've worked with over the years.
Mm.
And one of the people I got in touch with was Ian. And I went to see Ian. It was a few years ago now, and asked him if he. I said, "Look, Ian, do what you want, and I'll produce it, but we'll do a song about a Scottish song." And he, having been born in Scotland, fitted the bill, and I'd been in Jethro Tull, and so he decided to do a Scottish song called "A Wee Doch and Doris." Have you heard that song?
Oh, I'm not too familiar with my traditional Scottish
Right.
songs, but I can definitely look it up after the interview.
Anyway, so I asked him in what style he would like to do it, and then I put the track together, and I devised a section of it for, and I put a sample flute where he should play and all the rest of it, and I sent it to Ian, and he sang it, and he played flute on it, and it came back, and it was great, and so I have that at some point. So the Scottish independence thing has intervened, Liam, and I don't want to do anything that's pro or anti independence, and the whole thing becomes political and ugly. Everybody's got their own view, everybody's got their own perspective. I want, it's not that I wanted it to remain neutral or anything. I just don't want to participate in what can become a very ragged, affair, with everybody's differing viewpoints. So I also did a song with Simple Minds for the same album, and I've also done a song with another Scottish singer who I think is great, called Gary Clark, who used to be in Danny Wilson. When I Was Mary's Prayer. So I've got songs ready to go, but and one of them is Ian's, the artist, and I have to say he's, as I remember him, sensational.
That's great.
It becomes something, and trying to do an album like this becomes a bit of a hot potato, because then somebody will have a viewpoint as to whether it's a good or a bad thing that Scotland want to be independent of England and this, that, and the other. And I didn't want it to be overtaken by that. I wanted it to be each individual artist that I would work with. I wanted them to do their heart's desire,
Mm.
you know, and have a nice time. You know, and it could get so ugly, so it'll have to remain on the back burner for a wee while, I think.
Mm.
Or perhaps it's one of the other things that gets tipped into my
Agreed.
the hole in the ground. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, final question. This is the last
yeah,
one.
baby.
So,
Woo! What a marathon!
I know. I'm really interested into your story of your life, so I had to make it as long as I could. So, top 5
Well,
albums.
we've missed out on a huge amount of people that I've worked with.
Well,
But
would you like to mention someone now, maybe? Because
well, I was asked recently some of the, apart from Jethro Tull, uh, some of the crucial moments in my career. One of which was being phoned up, and I got phoned up by a session agency and said, go down to Mayfair Studios Monday. This was like Saturday or something. Go down on Monday. You're working. I go, great. Who is it? And she said, the agent, she said, the Bee Gees. And so I went to work with the Bee Gees, and I formed a friendship with Barry and Robin and Morris. And I worked on Robin's last ever album, but I got to be part of their orbit as well. You know in the same way that I did with Jethro Tull, and that was great experience for me. It was music that I could do, and I was indulging in, but it was quite far away from obviously Jethro Tull type music.
yeah,
But but music is, as I said, even in even the punk era, there's always something that's fabulous. Is if it's the energy or the notes or the chords or the desires. There's a metaphysical substance to all of this. It's the human condition to want to manifest music, and I've my life as being a musician with all these other musicians, whether they be schooled or natural or famous or not famous. It's been, I can assure you, what I consider to be, and I don't mean this fatuously or modestly. It's been an absolute privilege to 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 have a life like this with these people.
mm,
So I'm very grateful, and Jethro Tull are largely responsible.
definitely, indeed. I think Bee Gees as well have a bit of a connection here in Australia with.
Absolutely, absolutely, because they did come across to Australia, and the ball started rolling when they were out in Australia. So yes, I'm aware. I have this connection. You see, because somebody asked me about, well, you've done a lot of Australian artists. You worked with Sia, you worked with the Bee Gees, and you worked with Tina Arena, and there's an Australian engineer I occasionally work with now over here, and but it's, there's no formula to this. It's just that these are psyches that that can unite and fly for a bit, and then we move on.
Hmm, I think there's also something special about Australia and Scotland. I think what with them coming to Australia to settle, and we have a bit of a background in my family in particular. The Hare name comes from air, and
Oh yes, yeah.
on the west
Was it?
side of.
That's right. There used to be a big joke that in the pubs and clubs, usually announced before the bingo would take place. It would be first prize is a week in Butlins, which is a holiday camp in Ayr. Second prize is 2 weeks in Butlins in Ayr. But Ayr is lovely.
Yes.
I was by the way, it's apropos of nothing. In my bathroom or the downstairs toilet here, I have this tiny little cup that says Butlins Talent Heat Winner.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's when I was about 8 or 9. I was I was taken on holiday by my parents to Butlins in Ayr, where I won the talent competition.
Ooh,
So,
that sounds
so,
nice.
so yeah, I mean, the fix was in.
Yeah.
Even then.
I mean, obviously, Men at Work's Colin Hay is also from that way as well.
Who?
Colin Hay, Men at Work.
Oh, right, is he?
Yes, he is from Ayr as well. I looked it up.
Oh, he has my every sympathy.
Yes.
No, it's a lovely place to come from. Terrible place to go to, but I love. No, these are all the
Yeah, I think I
Scottish
heard.
pub jokes.
Yeah, I think I heard it's like the worst rated seaside town in Scotland or something like that.
Nah,
that
but
true?
I don't know. If it's the Scots are a very lovely race of individuals. So if there's providing there's a load of Scots people in Ayr, it's probably going to be good,
Yeah.
irrespective of its beach.
Yes.
Yes,
I do hope.
that's very
Yeah, I do hope
it's
to get
ve-
up there one day myself.
well. Let's hope it's not shut.
Yes, hopefully, like after COVID and everything is done, hopefully I can actually get up there
Oh,
and find my
yeah,
roots and everything.
yeah. Well, I am positive, given as I say, my feelings for my fellow Scots is you won't be disappointed.
Thank you. Like I said, my final topic I want to talk about is your top 5 albums of all time. Like, so your favorite 5 albums of all time that you've listened to through your life.
I try to answer. Always try. I mean, you can't have a top five. I mean, it's top, and they all occupy the same hierarchical spot, which is one, and there are about 100.
Mm.
But I try to think of this in terms of albums that seem to propel me from from one thing to another. I can never remember them chronologically, but I'll start with my at number. Let's see, 5 would be Tarkus by Emerson Lake and Palmer. I think that's a sensational album. The playing is great, the sound is great, the Hammond organ, the newly arrived Moog synthesizer, all just for a young mind, it was
Oh,
like fireworks going off in my head.
brilliant, brilliant.
And then I've been a lifelong fan of Stevie Wonder, and the album for me would be Inner Visions. Again, when there's a good example, Liam, as we started talking about when Stevie Wonder played drums on his albums. It was great. The two people I would wrestle, if I could go, if they built a time traveling gymnasium, I would go back and I'd wrestle the drum machine from Stevie Wonder and Ian Anderson. And Stevie Wonder would continue playing drums on all his albums, and Ian Anderson would never have discovered the Lynn drum machine. He would have he would always employ a drummer. That's if they invented a time traveling gymnasium. But I don't expect that to happen soon. Calling Elon Musk, but and that was number 5. So the album would be Inner Visions. There was as I became more and more convinced of the beauty of the fusion of rock and jazz at the time. Now I'm talking when I was a very young man, your age and younger. There was a keyboard player that I loved very much and continue to do so to this day. It's got so much spirit and heart and soul, and his name is David Sancious. The album I think would be, I think it's called True Stories or The Forest of Feelings. So David Sancious, high on my agenda there. 1, 2, 3, 4 would be, I think, Aja by Steely Dan. Aja again, they would contact the hottest players who would play in context and play beautifully with taste and purpose and desire, but also it was song based. So there were some great songs, and Donald Fagen being one of my favourite songwriters of all time. The Night Fly, but Aja was probably the one that did me. Let me see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And so, as I've told you, my own personal hero and the album that, let me see, can I get, yeah, I can get the album that made the difference, and it made all the difference, and it changed everything for me, everything. I think it's 1976 or thereabouts. And I remember I was in a flat in Brechin in Scotland, near Aberdeen. And I was given this record by a friend who knew a lot more about tasty music than I did. And he gave me this album, which meant that I had a record player, an amp, and 2 speakers, and this one record. I put this one record on and played the first track, and I was going, this is horrible. This is, oh, God, oh, this is horrible. Next track, even more horrible. Third track in, yeah, it's okay. Fourth track in, oh my God, this, I'm different now from what I was 10 minutes ago. I'm a different person. And that's because I listened to a band called Weather Report. The album was Black Market, and my hero, and I thank goodness I have met him and I've been able to tell him I love him. He's dead now. But his name is Joe Zawinul. He was the keyboard player in the band called Weather Report. But of course, there are so many people that my life has been immeasurably made into the thing that it is, and so, you know, an honourable mention to Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Jan Hammer, to the young musicians now that I so admire, Lewis Cole, Taylor Eigsty, Eldar Jangarov, Corey Henry of Snarky Puppy fame. Too many to mention. But for me, my heart will always belong to Joe Zawinul, and the music he could make was beyond anything. And I'm very grateful again to have witnessed him.
Yeah,
that's my thing.
I think definitely answering my own question, I think most of my top 5 choices would definitely be from the prog rock genre era of the 1970s. I think prog rock defined my taste of music. So Genesis, Gentle Giant, Rush, yes, King Crimson, all those bands.
Yeah. Actually, I should say that there was when I was doing compiling my top 10 and stuff, it was very important to me too that I witnessed. Do you know this thing when a band or an individual, you set out to initially maybe to try and emulate your hero or your band hero band, and sometimes it's that you can't get that good, but you find something else. You just can't get to how good that is, but you find something else. And at the time, there was a genre of music. Remember, we've been absolutely now. These are, I think, all these. Well, Joe Zawinul's from Vienna, but I think Keith Emerson's British. But most of the artists that I loved invariably were American, and so we're pretty inundated with, in my case, a lot of the American things. But there was a British movement that at the time that I thought, and I love still. Gentle Giant was important to me as well. And I love that album, Free Hand. I was just playing it just recently. I mean, I can go from track to track on that and play along, in the same way that I do Sergeant Pepper. The Beatles. That is a sensational piece of work. But also, this refers to the reason I say about this genre is because there was a movement in England, especially in the 70s, 60s, late 60s and 70s, that had this thing called the Canterbury sound, and Soft Machine had this, Egg had this, and then later on it would be in one of my favourite bands of all time, Hatfield in the North, and one of my favourite keyboard players of all time, Dave Stewart, not of Annie Lennox fame. Dave Stewart was in Hatfield in the North and National Health. It was the Canterbury sound. And for those that are attuned to this, the Canterbury sound was a Hammond organ, but not with a Leslie cabinet, not with the rotating cabinet. It was straight tone, but with the vibrato tab either on or off, and distorted, very distorted, either through a fuzz pedal or a ludicrously loud amplifier. And Dave Stewart was part of this movement. And at the same time, there was another British organist that is super important to me, and piano player, and his name is Brian Auger. Have you heard of Brian Auger?
What band is he from?
He was in, his own band was called Oblivion Express. They did. They came to prominence, or he came to prominence, in the I guess, would this be the 60s or early 70s? With Brian Auger, with Judy Driscoll. What's it called? This Wheels on Fire. Anyway, and then he went on to form the Oblivion Express. Now, Brian was a British, an English man, but in emulating some of his heroes, or say Jimmy Smith, who's an early organ jazz pioneer, Brian Auger found something else, and it spawned this organ straight tone, vibrato tab, no Leslie cabinet, and then that went into, as I say, Egg, Soft Machine, National Health, Caravan, Hatfield in the North. So these are important guys as well. I often, so the roll call is, it can never be 5 best albums. They are 100 best albums, all of which, in my mind, rest at number one in the charts.
You could almost just write a book about it if you really wanted to.
Well, they call it on the shoulders of giants, don't they? I mean, what our modern generation of being able to do this and talk to you, and access to YouTube, access to all of these people that you and I have, I thank my lucky stars.
Yeah, I definitely will have them. Sorry.
These are the great people, and hopefully these are all of these people you'll get to talk to, Liam.
Yeah.
All of these names are people. You can't talk to Joe Zawinul, but some of them you got to speak to. You got to get a hold of Brian Auger. You got to speak to Dave Stewart, not the Eurythmics Dave Stewart. These are the people that really, they built this city. Woo!
Yes, they built the prog. They built that sort of image that you like. So,
well, it's not just the image. They built this thing that we love. They really did, and these are the people that are important.
It's interesting. You mentioned Freehand as well. Freehand is actually getting a brand new re-release on vinyl. Actually, Stephen Wilson, who you may know from Porcupine Tree, has been doing a lot of their remixes, and that's coming up.
I saw that, and I have Freehand on vinyl, but the original vinyl.
Oh man, I would kill to have that.
Ba 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 lia ba 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 ba. See me, or what about in my way did I use you? Do you think I'd really abuse you? On reflection now, it doesn't matter what I can you say. It goes into a fugue style. Sensational. And not funky stuff. It's not the American funky stuff. This is something that's an English genre. This is
Exactly.
something that has identity, not in any kind of silly nationalistic way, but it has its identity because it's come from there.
Yes.
Like the Black American music is Black American jazz. They own that. That was their music form. But this stuff comes about from another land, and it's equally spectacular. We just don't get to hear it quite so much.
It's a shame, really. I think if you went funky enough, I think that keyboard riff that's so iconic in the title track is kind of a bit funky, using that clavinet sound.
Yes, but it had a different thrust. It wasn't funky to be funky. It was funky to function in service of something else. And I think a lot of funky shit is not funky shit anymore because it's designed to be funky, and that ain't funky anymore because you need to keep pushing. It has to be in the service of something. And a lot of stuff that's described as funky, I'm not hearing it that way. I just think it's banal. Sometimes, not all things. I mean, I've outlined who I think are the movers and shakers amongst the youngsters.
Yeah, I have the Power and the Glory on vinyl, which is that previous album with the playing card as the album cover from 1974.
Yes.
I like that one a lot.
What about this for a blast from the past? Green Slade. Oh.
Okay, this is a band I have no clue about because I don't think I've adventured that far.
Oh, you would. I think you would love it. What's the album I would go for? The Ass's Ears, I think. Dave Greenslade and Dave Lawson, both in the vanguard. Dave Greenslade is a great Hammond organ player. He uses a Leslie. It's not a straight tone now. Dave Greenslade played, and Dave Lawson played an ARP Odyssey. That's kind of, that's great.
Yep.
This is 70s stuff, but it sounds great. This is when they went into a fluffy studio and they could plug into valve compressors that did work.
Yes.
Instead of valve compressors just to look good. I know of an engineer that I saw him. He had a collection of all these vintage things, compressors and EQs, but they were all in bypass because he didn't know what to do with them. And also they weren't the thing that defined the music. It wasn't the gear that defined the music anyway. It was the squashy biological entity thrashing away on whatever it was in the big room that was making the difference.
That's totally interesting. I'll have to keep them in mind and see if I can spot some vinyl out here in Australia, because usually some prog rock acts do show up in like vinyl secondhand shops. So like I found my Gentle Giant stuff here in Australia, and I found all my Jethro Tull stuff in Australia. So
well, it's understandable. Now, given that it's oh my goodness.
we've been talking for a long time.
I'm sorry, I can talk for England and Scotland. Will you be editing this down, Liam?
Yes, I could possibly pull it over 2 parts as well. So
yeah, okay. Well, I wish you much success in attempting to do so.
We rambled on. We got off topic, but we got off topic at the end.
Well, as I say, as I haven't been in Jethro Tull for nearly 40 years, I can't be that informative, I suppose. But I hope I've been of some interest to you.
Well, you have. You've definitely given me some stories that I didn't know about Ian Anderson, and gave me a bit of a insight from a keyboardist point of view of what it was like working with Tull. And
you got it. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for taking time out and speaking with me. I think it's like past midnight now here in Australia, so
I thought you were looking a bit sleepy.
yeah, it's like 1:32 a.m. on a Tuesday
Is it?
morning.
Oh, that doesn't exist that time. No, that doesn't exist.
No, when you're talking with music, it just seems like forever.
Yes. Well, sadly, I'm attributed to Frank Zappa. I don't think it was Frank Zappa that said that, by the way. He's another one of my bucket list artists. But talking about music is like tap dancing about architecture. There's it's mysterious and eternal.
Yes, it can lead on to many things.
Yes, you got it, Liam. Thank you for getting in touch with me. I hope that was of some interest to your listeners.
Yes, it was indeed.
Under Wraps.
Blimey.
Under Wraps. Under Wraps. Under Wraps.